My name is John, just a simple, sad American, divorced and trying to figure things out. But this story isn't about me or the mess my life had become. It's about a Japanese man I met one evening in a small, tucked-away Japanese bar in New York. The warm, amber light of paper lanterns illuminated the room, blending seamlessly with the quiet hum of conversation. The mingling aromas of fresh sushi and the sharp, earthy scent of sake created an ambiance that felt miles away from the bustling city outside. By then, I was already on my second bottle of sake. I wasn't much of a drinker, not usually, but lately life had pushed me toward trying new things. They say that's what you're supposed to do after a divorce. Shake up the monotony, take risks, rediscover yourself. So here I was, searching for something. This bar had become a strange comfort, a place where I could disappear into its unfamiliarity. It felt oddly fitting. Divorce has a way of turning even the most familiar parts of your life into something foreign. I'd sit there, night after night, feeling like a stranger in my own skin, trying to piece together how everything fell apart. That night, the bar was alive, but not crowded. It had just enough people to keep the atmosphere warm without being overwhelming. As I raised the small ceramic cup of sake to my lips, savoring its clean, fiery heat, the door creaked open. A man entered, a Japanese man, probably in his late 40s. There was a quiet, self-assured energy about him, the kind that made people take notice without him even trying. He exchanged a few words with the bartender in rapid-fire Japanese, their interactions smooth and practiced. Moments later, he settled onto the stool next to mine, ordering his own sake and a plate of sushi. For reasons I couldn't immediately explain, he stood out to me. Maybe it was his calm demeanor, the kind of serenity you only find in people who've weathered storms and come out the other side. He caught my gaze, nodded slightly, and raised his sake cup in a silent gesture, a shared toast between strangers. "Tough evening?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate, carrying the tone of someone who wasn't in a hurry for answers. I gave a small chuckle and sipped my drink. "You could say that, though honestly it's been a rough couple of months." He responded with a faint smile, as though he understood everything without needing the details. That's the thing about certain encounters. Sometimes words aren't necessary. Just the presence of someone who gets it can be enough. Finally, I let the word slip out. Divorce. The sound of it lingered between us, raw and unfiltered. It's fresh. Feels impossible to shake off. He set his cup down gently, nodding as if to acknowledge the weight of what I had just shared. I understand. Divorce feels like an ending, but it's not the end. It's the closing of one chapter. There was a pause as he drew a slow, deliberate breath. His gaze shifted toward the bar, distant, like he was staring at something far beyond the rows of bottles lined neatly on the shelf. "I've been through it too," he said finally, his tone layered with quiet conviction. Something about the way he spoke drew me in. His words weren't just idle observations. They carried a depth, a weight that made me want to hear more. I poured myself another cup, turning slightly towards him, ready to listen. This all took place 10 years ago in Kyoto, in a bar much like the one where we were sitting now. I had arrived around 9 p.m., planning to meet my best friend Takashi for our usual drinks. 2 hours later, the air in the bar felt heavy, almost suffocating. Takashi, normally the life of the conversation, sat unusually quiet, nursing his drink in silence. By the time the clock struck 11, I noticed a shift in his expression. He seemed to have made up his mind about something, and finally, he spoke. "Actually," he began hesitantly, "your wife, it seems like she's having an affair." The words landed like a heavy blow, echoing in the stillness between us. For a moment, I couldn't process it. It was impossible. My wife and I had been inseparable since childhood. More than just a couple. We were a team. Betrayal wasn't something I could imagine from her. But later that night, when I confronted her, the truth came out with alarming ease. She admitted it with a calm, almost detached tone, as if she were confessing to something mundane. "Yeah, I did," she said plainly, her tired eyes meeting mine. "I'm sorry." And just like that, we agreed to divorce. There wasn't a screaming match or dramatic accusations, just an unspoken acknowledgement that the end had come. On the day she left, standing by the door with a suitcase in hand, She looked back at me with a small, bittersweet smile. "Thank you for everything. I'm sorry," she said before walking out. At the time, I thought she was apologizing for the affair itself. But as the days turned into weeks and the pieces began to settle, I realized her words carried a deeper meaning. She wasn't just sorry for what she did. She was sorry for something else entirely. My wife and I had known each other all our lives. Growing up as next-door neighbors, our families were close, and from kindergarten onward, we were practically siblings. I still remember her grin one summer afternoon when we were playing outside. "Let's get married when we grow up," she said with a giggle, her ponytail swaying in the breeze. I laughed it off then, thinking it was just the sort of thing kids say. Never did I imagine that years later, her words would become a reality. By middle school, things began to change. She blossomed into someone everyone adored, popular, cheerful, the kind of person who drew others to her effortlessly. I, on the other hand, remained the childhood friend in the background. One day, a classmate joked, "You better hurry up or someone else is going to steal her from you." In a panic, I confessed my feelings at the end of our first year. To my astonishment, she said yes. We began dating, and eventually, at 25, we tied the knot. "Marrying my first love, can you believe it? If only I could tell my kindergarten self," she said on our wedding day, her face glowing with joy. For the first 5 years, everything felt perfect. I loved her deeply and was sure she loved me too. She had this way of making me feel special, like when she would pat my head after a tough day or tease me with her infectious laugh. Those little gestures only deepened my affection for her. We'd talked about having kids someday, but for the moment, we were content being just the two of us. Whenever I mentioned it, she'd laugh and tease, "You'll get jealous when we have kids, won't you? You're so spoiled." Then came the day everything began to unravel, though I didn't know it at the time. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon and we were watching variety shows together when she suddenly grimaced. "Sorry," she said, clutching her stomach. "It hurts a bit." Alarmed, I asked, "Should we go to the hospital?" She shook her head. "It's nothing, it'll pass," she replied, brushing it off with her usual toughness. But over the next few days, her discomfort grew. I wanted to insist on a doctor's visit, but her confident demeanor held me back. It wasn't until a week later that she finally agreed, though she insisted I stay at work. "It's no big deal," she said with a reassuring smile. "You go to work and do your best." I spent that entire day distracted, the weight of unease gnawing at me. When I returned home, she greeted me with her usual smile. "It was just a stomachache," she said lightly. "Sorry for worrying you." Relief washed over me and I ordered expensive sushi to celebrate. Watching her laugh and eat with gusto, I felt a flicker of hope that everything was back to normal. But that evening of laughter and teasing was merely a mirage. I didn't realize it yet, but it marked the beginning of the end. It was around the time I had almost forgotten about my wife's stomach troubles when she started spending more time with her close friend Yukiko. They had been inseparable since elementary school, their bond like sisters. I didn't know Yukiko well back then. We were rarely in the same classes. But by middle school, we both joined the track and field club, and our paths began to cross more often. I even remember teasingly competing with Yukiko over who was closer to my wife. As their outings became more frequent, I assumed my wife was simply reconnecting with her best friend, taking advantage of her newfound confidence in traveling. It didn't bother me. In fact, I found myself enjoying the sight of her returning home with souvenirs and stories from various places, her face glowing with excitement. One evening, she mentioned she was planning a week-long trip, 7 nights, 8 days, with Yukiko. "That's a long trip," I remarked, and she lit up, showing me her travel magazine filled with sticky notes. Her enthusiasm was contagious. On the morning of her departure, I saw her off with a smile, already looking forward to the gifts and tales she'd bring back. That weekend, a local friend invited me out for drinks. It was a small group of us, 4 guys who'd known each other since middle school. Naturally, the conversation veered toward my wife. She was well known among our circle. "How's she doing? You're still as crazy about her as ever, huh? I can't even imagine you two breaking up." The teasing was lighthearted, and perhaps because I had a few drinks in me, I joined in, gushing about how much I loved her. But there was one person at the table who didn't join the banter, my best friend Takashi. Usually the loudest and most animated of the group, He seemed uncharacteristically quiet that night. After 2 hours, we called it a night and began walking to the station. That's when Takashi pulled me aside. "Hey," he said softly, "how about one more drink? Just the two of us." I hesitated for a moment. It wasn't like him to act so serious, but curiosity went out and I agreed. We found a quiet bar, and after ordering drinks, we sat in silence. There was an unusual heaviness in the air, and Takashi seemed to be wrestling with his thoughts. I waited, letting him take his time, though I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Finally, after what felt like forever, Takashi broke the silence. He hesitated, his words slow and deliberate, as though gauging how I might react. "I saw her," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your wife. She was walking with another man. I think she's cheating on you." For a moment, everything inside me froze. His words echoed in my mind, impossible to reconcile with the woman I loved and trusted so completely. "No," I told myself firmly. "There's no way." I tried to keep calm, forcing myself to dismiss the accusation. My wife and I had been together for years. I trusted her implicitly. And Takashi, he had seen how much we loved each other. He had teased us endlessly for being a couple that was still so deeply affectionate. But as his words sank in, they started to feel like a challenge to my trust in her. Was he really accusing my wife, my lifelong partner, of being unfaithful? "You've always been like this," I said sharply, my anger rising. "Always jumping to conclusions, always looking at things the wrong way." The alcohol, combined with my frustration, made my voice louder than I intended. I glared at him, my chest tight with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You need to stop," I snapped, shoving back my chair and storming out of the bar, leaving him sitting there in silence. What happened after I left the bar is a bit of a haze. I remember muttering complaints about Takashi as I made my way home, the alcohol swirling heavily in my system. Even after getting back, the frustration lingered, and I paced around trying to shake it off. I knew I needed to calm down, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. Then my phone buzzed. A notification from Lean lit up the screen. My vision, clouded by both alcohol and anger, struggled to focus. To my surprise, it was a message from Yukiko. Yukiko? Wasn't she supposed to be on the trip with my wife? I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was something minor. Without hesitation, I opened the message. The moment I read its contents, the haze of alcohol vanished in an instant. "I wasn't sure whether to tell you, but I decided you should know. She's cheating on you." My heart sank as I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Attached to the message was a photo of my wife entering a hotel with a man. As I scrolled, more images followed. Instagram screenshots I'd never seen before. They told a story I didn't want to believe. Pictures of her dining with a man, subtle but undeniable clues of her infidelity. The cold shock washed over me, draining the warmth from my body. So this is what people mean by blood running cold. My mind raced with questions. Why? How could she do this? I thought we were forever. The days after that were a blur. I drifted through them in a daze, each hour marked by a crushing weight in my chest. All I could do was wait. Wait for her to come home from the trip so I could face her. When she finally returned, it felt surreal. The door creaked open, and her cheerful voice rang out as if nothing had happened. "I'm home. Are you here?" she called, her tone as bright and casual as ever. She smiled as she set her bags down, unloading souvenirs and launching into a lively recount of her trip. "And then Yukiko did this," she began, rattling off stories without pause. Her words filled the room, spilling over the silence I maintained. Normally she'd notice if I was quiet, but this time she didn't seem to care. Or maybe she was deliberately ignoring it. Her energy felt unnatural, almost forced. As she continued, I realized something was off. She wasn't just talking. She was trying to drown the room in meaningless chatter, like she was desperately avoiding an inevitable confrontation. Her forced cheer only made it worse. "Stop," I said abruptly, cutting her off. My voice was calm but firm. She froze, her words hanging midair. "What?" "You don't have to pretend anymore. I know everything." A flicker of panic crossed her face, followed by hesitation. What are you talking about? You cheated on me. I said, my voice steady. Just tell me the truth. Her expression shifted again. For a brief moment, I thought I saw relief in her eyes, like a burden had been lifted. She sighed and nodded. Yeah, I cheated, she admitted quietly, her voice resigned. Hearing her say it out loud felt like a physical blow. The words cut through me, sharp and deep, and yet I couldn't find the anger I thought I would feel. Instead, I was overwhelmed by a painful realization. I still loved her. Despite everything, I loved her. I didn't know what to say. The weight of her betrayal was too much to process. Without another word, I turned and locked myself in my room, letting the silence swallow me. After that night, we both tried to act like things were normal, but the cracks in our relationship were impossible to ignore. We couldn't sync the way we used to. Conversations felt strained, and the light in her smile had disappeared. I avoided her as much as I could, but the distance between us only made the pain worse. It wasn't just the affair that haunted me. It was the loss of what we once had. The laughter, the ease, the connection we'd shared so naturally. Those days felt like they had vanished overnight. More than her infidelity, it was the emptiness that hurt the most. The realization that we might never get back to the way things were was unbearable. If that was the reality, then perhaps it was time to let go. Once I made the decision, everything moved fast. A few days later, I sat my wife down and told her I wanted a divorce. She didn't seem surprised. There was no argument, no resistance. She quietly agreed and signed the papers without hesitation. I can't imagine you two ever splitting up. That phrase, spoken by someone long ago, kept playing in my mind, a cruel reminder of what we had once been. I couldn't imagine it either, not then, not even now. The thought of how easily everything had unraveled was suffocating. We had spent years building something together, yet the end came so swiftly, so cleanly. It felt almost hollow. As sadness welled up inside me, I fought back tears and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of my heart. If we stay like this, neither of us will be happy, I said. Please, put your happiness first. Even in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Despite everything, I wanted her to find happiness, even if it wasn't with me. If someone better comes along, I added softly, I'll forgive you. Just get remarried and be happy. And with that, our marriage came to an end. The day she moved out, she stood at the door with her suitcase, hesitating for a moment. Her eyes met mine, and she offered a faint smile, a bittersweet mixture of gratitude and regret. I'm sorry, she said. Thank you for everything. With those words, she turned and walked out of my life. But just before the door closed, she glanced back one last time. Let's meet again someday, she murmured, her smile unexpectedly tender, almost haunting in its sincerity. I stood there, rooted in place, unable to respond. That smile, more unforgettable than any I'd ever seen, stayed with me, lingering in my mind long after she was gone. In the days that followed, I buried myself in work, desperate to escape the emptiness left behind. To anyone watching, I must have looked pitiful. I even started going to office drinking parties I used to avoid, where I once proudly said, "My wife's waiting for me at home." News of my divorce spread quickly at the company. It was the kind of old-fashioned workplace where promotions were tied to having a stable home life. Realizing my future there was limited, I decided it was time for a change. I left the city and took a job in a rural government office. The move wasn't uncommon. More people were relocating to the countryside, but for me, it was an escape. I needed distance from the town where every corner seemed to hold memories of her. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into the new job, immersing myself completely. Slowly, the sting of betrayal began to fade. 6 months passed, and though the pain wasn't entirely gone, I had found a rhythm in my new life. Then, one quiet Sunday afternoon, the doorbell rang. Visitors were rare for me, and I wasn't antisocial, but my interactions with colleagues stayed professional, limited to shared lunches. Weekends were my own, spent in quiet solitude. Curious, I went to the door. When I opened it, I was completely unprepared for who stood on the other side. "Yukiko?" I stammered, my surprise evident. I hadn't spoken to her since the day she sent me the message that shattered my world. A part of me had resented her for revealing the affair, even though I knew it wasn't her fault. I always assumed she'd taken my wife's side, that her actions had been driven by concern for her best friend. Before I could say anything more, Yukiko's eyes filled with tears. She broke down right in front of me, sobbing and apologizing over and over. I was frozen, unsure of how to react. "Why are you apologizing?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky with confusion. She didn't answer right away, her tears falling faster. Not wanting to draw attention from my neighbors, I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. My small one-room apartment wasn't much, but it was tidy, surprisingly so for someone living alone. She hesitated briefly before stepping inside, wiping her eyes as she tried to regain her composure. I still didn't understand why she was here, but something in her expression told me this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. I thought Yukiko might at least comment on how tidy my apartment was, but instead, she just sat there, tears streaming down her face, apologizing over and over. "Hey, Yukiko, calm down," I said gently, trying to ease the tension. "Here, have some coffee." I handed her a freshly brewed cup, hoping it would help her regain some composure. She sniffled for a while, clutching the cup in both hands, but after a few sips, her breathing steadied. She wiped her face with trembling fingers, then looked directly at me. Without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to me. I hesitated before taking it, wondering fleetingly if this was some kind of demand for compensation. But when I looked closer, my breath caught. Written on the envelope, in handwriting I knew better than my own, were the words, "To my dearest." It was my wife's handwriting. My heart pounded as I opened the envelope, my hands trembling. Inside was a letter. The weight of it felt unbearable even before I began to read. The letter started simply, but the words hit like a tidal wave. "To you, I know it must seem cruel of me to ask how you're doing after everything I've put you through, but there's something I absolutely need to tell you, so please read this to the end. Do you remember when I went to the hospital 5 years into our marriage, complaining about stomach pains? The truth is, the doctor told me I had pancreatic cancer. It was already advanced. He said I had at most 6 months to live. When I heard the word cancer, I wasn't shocked for myself. I was devastated for you. My first thought was, what would you do if you knew? But I already knew the answer. You'd sacrifice everything, push yourself beyond your limits to take care of me. That's just the kind of person you are. And if our roles were reversed, I know I'd do the same. I couldn't stand the thought of putting you through that. I couldn't bear to see you sad, worrying about me every moment. So, I made a decision. When the doctor asked who to notify in case of an emergency, I told him to contact only my parents. I decided not to tell you. The trips with Yukiko weren't vacations, they were hospital visits. That week-long trip I took, it was a hospital stay. The treatments were harsh, and trying to keep up the lie was exhausting. I'd come home with fake souvenirs and made-up stories, and every time I saw you smile and listen so eagerly, I found the strength to keep going. But the closer I got to the edge, the more terrified I became. I kept thinking, how much longer can I keep smiling for him? How much longer until he notices? I didn't want you to see me deteriorate. I didn't want you to carry that burden. So, I made the worst decision of my life. I lied. I asked Takashi and Yukiko to help me stage an affair, to make you hate me, to make it easier for you to leave me. We faked everything, even the Instagram posts. Yukiko and Takashi went along with my selfish request because they cared about me. Please don't blame them for any of this. When I came home from the hospital that one time and you said, "I already know everything," I panicked. For a moment, I thought you'd discover the truth. But then I realized the plan had worked, at least partly. Except you didn't hate me. No matter how much I tried to push you away, you never got angry. You never stopped being the person I fell in love with. I know I've caused you immeasurable pain, and I don't expect forgiveness. But please know that from the bottom of my heart, I'm so sorry. By the time I reached the end, the letter was shaking in my hands. My chest felt tight, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to process everything I had just read. The room seemed impossibly heavy, weighed down by the truth she had hidden, the lies she had spun. Not to betray me, but to protect me from her own unbearable reality. I looked up at Yukiko, who was sitting silently across from me, her face streaked with fresh tears. And in that moment, everything fell into place. The trips, the souvenirs, the distance between us, even the staged affair. It had all been a desperate attempt to shield me from the pain she thought I couldn't bear to face. I suppose I should have told you directly. Writing this in a letter probably seems insincere, but please let me apologize. Her words on the page felt so fragile, as if they might vanish if I blinked too hard. There's one last thing I need to say. You always praised my smile, saying it gave you strength, but I want you to know, it was your smile that sustained me. From the moment we met, I've loved you. Even in kindergarten, when we made that silly promise to get married one day, I meant it. You didn't take it seriously, but I did, even as a child. When time passed and you didn't confess, I grew restless. So when we finally started dating in middle school, I was overjoyed. And when we got married, I thought I had reached a happiness I'd never even dared to dream of. I believed it would last forever. I wanted so badly to spend more time with you, to share more smiles, to see the future we had both imagined. I dreamed of us one day, holding our children together, building a life filled with joy, but I'll leave that dream to someone else. Someone who can walk beside you in my place. Please don't worry about me. You're a wonderful person, and I know you'll find someone even better than me. So from now on, please think of your own happiness first. I'll always be praying for it. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes and I couldn't read anymore, but the weight of what she'd written was already pressing down on me. Beside me, Yukiko, who had been silently reading along, broke into fresh sobs. Her earlier tears returned in full force, her shoulders shaking as she tried to speak. Through choked breaths, she began to explain. After her diagnosis, she came to Takashi and me right away. She didn't want to tell you, no matter what. She made us promise to help her with her plan, even though I begged her to just be honest. Yukiko wiped at her face, her voice trembling with the memory. I told her from the start it wasn't fair to you. But she was so stubborn, so determined. In the end, I couldn't refuse her. I just couldn't. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. But it wasn't her plan, not entirely. It was Takashi who came up with most of it. He thought staging an affair would give you a reason to let her go, to move on without guilt. That's why he said those things to you that night. Her words hit me like a wave. That strange conversation after the drinking party, Takashi's reluctance to speak. It all made sense now. He had been playing a role, just like Yukiko, even though it must have torn him apart to do it. Regret flared inside me. I thought of the harsh words I had thrown at him, the way I'd stormed out and left him behind. I hadn't spoken to him since, but now wasn't the time to dwell on that. First, I had to focus on her. Now that I knew the truth, I couldn't leave things as they were. I had to see her. I needed to hold her, to tell her how much I still loved her, even if I couldn't see her smile again. Where is she? I asked, my voice cracking. Which hospital is she at? But Yukiko didn't answer. Her face crumpled, her tears spilling over again. She passed away. Her words struck me like a blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I stared at her, unable to process what she'd just said. After the divorce, her condition deteriorated, Yukiko explained through sobs. The prognosis was never good, but the treatments became unbearable. She chose palliative care and spent her final days at her parents' home. Last month, she slipped away in her sleep. I couldn't respond. The words caught in my throat, unable to escape. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, sitting there in stunned silence. No tears came. No sound escaped my lips. I was hollow, as if every piece of me had been drained, leaving nothing but an empty shell. The room seemed to close in around me, suffocating in its silence. Her letter rested on the table, its words etched into my mind, but I could no longer look at it. She had been gone all this time, and I had never known. It felt like the world had shattered. Yukiko, her gaze carefully fixed on me, continued speaking, her voice soft but resolute. During her illness, she often said she hoped you would forget about her soon and start a new family. She explained that the letter had been found by my wife's parents while going through her belongings at the hospital. It had been tucked beneath the bed covers. She had written it, but perhaps she had never intended for me to see it. Out of respect, her parents didn't read its contents, keeping it safe until Yukiko convinced them to let her bring it to me. Even in her final days, my wife had wanted to uphold her lie, shielding me from the truth. But Yukiko, who had celebrated our love more than anyone, couldn't bear to let things remain unresolved. "I had to come," Yukiko said through her tears. "You deserve to know." Her visit brought me clarity I never thought I'd find. For the first time, I understood my wife's choices, her love, her sacrifice, her fears. Weakly, I thanked Yukiko, my voice barely audible, and saw her off as she left, still worried about my state of mind. And then, once I was alone, the grief consumed me. That night, I cried harder than I ever had before. The sadness I felt during the divorce paled in comparison to this. This was final. She was truly gone. There was no way to mend things, no way to go back. The weeks that followed passed in a fog. I drifted through days, unsure if I was even alive inside. The thought of following her crossed my mind more than once. But deep down, I knew I couldn't betray her final wish. She had wanted me to live, to find happiness. Around that time, Yukiko began visiting regularly. "This town is so peaceful," she said one day, smiling softly. "Maybe I'll move here too." Her humor was strange, but it brought a flicker of warmth to my otherwise empty days. Her presence became a lifeline, her visits pulling me from the darkness I hadn't realized was consuming me. On weekends, she brought home-cooked meals, staying to share stories and comfort. Slowly, her kindness began to lift the weight on my heart. Over time, I started to recover. A year passed, and Yukiko's constant support had become something more. She wasn't just a visitor or a friend. She was a part of my life now, a part I couldn't imagine losing. One quiet evening, I finally admitted, "I don't think I would have made it through without you." Her face softened as she confessed her own feelings. "At first it was guilt," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I owed it to her to help you. But over time, it wasn't just guilt. I wanted to be here for you." Her words struck something deep within me, and I knew. I reached for her hand, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "I feel the same." She whispered one word, "Yes." But then she added, "On one condition, you must never forget her. That's all I ask." A year later, we were married, and soon after, we had a daughter. Holding our baby girl for the first time, I couldn't help but notice how her bright smile resembled my late wife's, a smile that could light up a room. Yukiko noticed my hesitation and asked, "What's wrong?" "I was thinking about her name," I said, holding up a piece of paper with the name I had written. "What do you think of this?" The name was Kaho, meaning fragrance or blessing. It felt like the perfect tribute to my wife Sachiko, whose name meant child of happiness. In this way, a part of her would live on, woven into our new life. Yukiko smiled warmly. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "May she grow up carrying that spirit." And so we named her Kaho. Not long after Kaho's birth, I suggested we visit my wife's grave. Yukiko nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. On the anniversary of her passing, the three of us, Yukiko, Kaho, and I, went together. We brought flowers and small gifts from the market, laying them gently on the stone. As I stood there, I whispered, "Thank you. I will treasure the gift you gave me forever." Clasping my hands in prayer, tears quietly spilled down my cheeks. "Thank you," I said aloud, my voice steady despite the emotions welling within, "for the happiness you brought into my life. Every day with you was a blessing. And now I will live those days again, with Yukiko and Kaho for you." Just then, a tiny hand reached up and touched my head. Startled, I glanced at Kaho, cradled in Yukiko's arms, her small fingers stroking my hair gently. It was exactly the way my wife used to comfort me, bringing back a moment I thought I had lost forever. I sat there back in the bar, my jaw slack as I realized I was still holding the same cup of sake from when he'd started his story. His words had left me frozen, lingering in the quiet between us. For a moment, I thought about saying something, maybe offering words of comfort or thanks for sharing such a deeply personal story. But the weight of it all felt too heavy. Nothing I could say would be enough. Without a word, I stood up, needing air to escape the intensity of the moment. My thoughts churned as I stepped outside into the cool New York night. My hand reached instinctively for my phone. I stared at a number I hadn't called in months. My ex-wife's. What was I doing? Looking for closure? Hoping for a confession that might make sense of the pain I'd buried. My thumb hovered over the call button for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, then her voice, sharp and irritated, cut through the silence. "Hello, John? Why are you calling me at this hour? Are you drunk?" Her tone stung, sharper than I expected. For a fleeting moment, I thought about apologizing, about trying to find common ground. Maybe the man's story had softened me enough to believe it was possible. But then her voice came again, cold and impatient. "John, what do you want?" The words I had prepared died in my throat. "Just wanted to see if you were okay," I said finally, my voice hollow. "Yeah, I'm fine. Now drop the damn phone and forget this number." The line went dead. No, she hadn't changed. She wasn't part of some tragic, misunderstood plan. She had cheated. And that was all there was to it.